provided new context to his decisions about how he handled the Clinton email and Russia investigations pre-election. His testimony also led to new questions about former Attorney General Loretta Lynch and her role. And he pushed back on some presidential speculation. The controversial spending bill that had Republicans rising up for what was in and not in that bill has now passed the House and heads to the U.S. Senate. But the biggest news today, new progress toward a health care reform bill that Republicans seem to be rallying around tonight, and a vote that may be coming as soon as tomorrow. We'll show you what's changed in the last several hours. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel starts us off tonight on Capitol Hill. Good evening, Mike.
Brett, good evening. After weeks of struggling to come up with enough support, Republican sources say there's now real momentum. House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy says they're getting very close, and some predict a vote could come as soon as tomorrow.
I support the bill with this amendment that's going to be included as part of the rules package when we consider this likely tomorrow.
Upton is offering help for those with pre-existing conditions and paying their premiums by providing $8 billion over 5 years. After a White House meeting with the President, Vice President, and Legislative Affairs Director Mark Short, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee said the updated bill would work for the American people.
And I believe we've done that now with some changes to the legislation that we'll be bringing forward when it comes to the issue of making sure people with pre-existing coverage have the care and support that they need.
And there are signs this change could be the breakthrough.
Today, we're here announcing that with this addition that we brought to the President and sold him on in over an hour meeting in here with him, that we're both yeses on the bill.
Attention quickly shifted to conservative members of the House Freedom Caucus who signaled they're still on board with this package.
We're focused on giving states the ability to get that waiver and get out from under the regulations that are driving up premiums for families, plain and simple. So while this is not full repeal, it's the best we think we can get out of the House. We're willing to support it and then keep working for full repeal.
Ahead of a potential vote in the House, the Senate Democratic leader said throwing money at the problem might not work.
Even if the new version of Trump Care passes the House, we hope it doesn't, its chances for survival in the Senate are small. We don't even know if the new version would survive the rules under reconciliation.
Also today, the House voted 309 to 118 to pass the $1.1 trillion government funding package to keep the lights on through September. Democrats were needed with 103 GOP defections.
You're not seeing a lot of the White House priorities in this bill. So I don't see how we can say that it's a win for the American people or for the election that just happened.
The $1.1 trillion package now goes to the Senate, where it is expected to pass. That would put off further funding drama until September or so. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thanks. We'll head back for breaking news as we get it on that decision, whether the vote's tomorrow or not. Meantime, the last major individual health insurer is reportedly set to leave Iowa. The Des Moines Register reports that means more than 70,000 people could be without coverage options next year. The state's two other big individual insurers are both pulling out, citing huge losses. Now Medica, a Minnesota-based company, says it is close to a decision on abandoning that market in Iowa. The head of the FBI says he stands by his decision to alert Congress about a new phase of the Hillary Clinton email investigation less than 2 weeks before the election. Yesterday, Clinton blamed James Comey in part for her loss last November. Today, many Democrats joined that chorus. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge shows us tonight.
So help God.
The FBI director defended his decision to reopen the Clinton email probe 11 days before Americans went to the polls.
It makes me mildly nauseous to think that we might have had some impact on the election.
Director Comey told the Senate Judiciary Committee thousands of Clinton emails, many new to investigators and classified, were found on Anthony Weiner's computer as part of a separate criminal case. Weiner shared the laptop with his now estranged wife and Clinton aide Huma Abedin.
You took an enormous gamble. The gamble was that there was something there that would invalidate her candidacy. and there wasn't.
Everybody who disagrees with me has to come back to October 28th. Would you speak or would you conceal?
Well, Director, I do think there was a third door available to you in late last year, just before the election, and that was to confirm the existence of an ongoing investigation about the Trump campaign.
Comey was pressed on the decision not to prosecute Abedin or Weiner for mishandling classified information.
How does that conduct not directly violate that statute?
This exchange provided one of the few lighthearted moments during the 4-hour hearing.
That anybody that lets Anthony Weiner had classified information probably should be prosecuted. Well, if our laws don't cover that, they probably should.
There's no Anthony Weiner statute, but there's already
Well, maybe we need one.
Comey said he couldn't talk about a document reportedly obtained by Russian hackers that implied then Attorney General Loretta Lynch would block criminal charges against then candidate Clinton.
Did the FBI interview the person who wrote the email? If not, why not?
I have to give you the same answer. I can't talk about that in an unclassified setting.
Comey said he took on the burden of speaking publicly last July when he recommended against criminal charges for Clinton because his boss put her impartiality in doubt.
The capper was, and I'm not picking on the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, who I like very much, but her meeting with President Clinton on that airplane was the capper for me.
Comey would not disclose the Bureau's payments to or relationship with Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer who wrote the unverified Trump dossier.
Did anyone from the FBI have interactions with Mr. Steele regarding the issue?
It's not a question that I can answer in this forum.
The failure to provide answers finally boiled over.
If I, Chuck Grassley, as a private citizen, file a Freedom of Information Act, and you give me more information than you'll give to Senator Chuck Grassley, how do you justify that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't.
What do you mean it's a good question? How do you justify it?
What I was going to say, it's a good question. I can't as I sit here.
Ye gods.
The FBI director said he is the subject of an ongoing Inspector General's investigation into how the FBI and Justice Department handled the Clinton email case. Director Comey confirmed he has been interviewed. And while there's no timeline for the report, it is expected to tackle Lynch's meeting with Bill Clinton 1 week before his wife's FBI interview, Brett.
And Catherine, what's happening on the investigation into the unmasking of Trump associates?
Well, a congressional source confirms to Fox News tonight that President Obama's former National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, who's at the heart of the unmasking allegations, has passed on an invitation to testify Monday before a Senate committee. In a letter, Rice's lawyer said it was too short notice and the invitation was not extended on a bipartisan basis. Rice will assist congressional investigators, but only in a non-public classified setting, Brett.
Okay, more on this with the panel. Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome. At
least 8 Afghan civilians were killed and 3 American service members wounded in an ISIS suicide car bombing near the U.S. Embassy in Kabul today. An Afghan official says another 25 civilians were injured in the morning rush hour attack. 2 U.S. officials tell Fox News Iran attempted to launch a cruise missile from a submarine in the Strait of Hormuz Tuesday. They say the test failed. In February, Iran claimed to have successfully tested a submarine-launched missile. It's not clear if Tuesday's was the first to launch underwater from a submarine. President Trump says it is up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to make peace, but he also says he's willing to do what he can. The president met with the Palestinian Authority's leader today. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has that story live from the North Lawn. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening to you. It seems that every new administration comes in with lofty goals of finally being the one to forge a Middle East peace agreement. Well, the Trump administration is no different.
Thank you for being here.
It was their first meeting, but the instant chemistry between President Trump and Mahmoud Abbas was unmistakable. The question, is it enough to bridge the unbridgeable gaps between Israel and the Palestinians?
Any agreement cannot be imposed by the United States or by any other nation. The Palestinians and Israelis must work together to reach an agreement that allows both peoples to live, worship, and thrive and prosper in peace.
Before the two leaders even met, Abbas laid down a marker, one he repeated in the joint statement. Israel must withdraw to borders in place before the 1967 Six-Day War and accept East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state if it wants peace.
Mr. President, it's about time for Israel to end its occupation of our people and of our land.
But President Trump had some markers of his own, demanding that the Palestinian Authority stop payments to Palestinians held in Israeli prisons and their families, and to rein in anti-Israel incitement by Palestinian media. While President Trump is declaredly pro-Israel, Palestinians believe he is the one president who might actually strike a deal.
The president's ability to connect with an individual, to work with them towards a shared goal, to have backroom diplomacy, is something that is going to continue to pay dividends and get results for this country.
Before the meeting, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster primed the pump at the Israel Independence Day dinner, saying the president is, quote, not a super patient man and, quote, does not have time to debate over doctrine. His reputation as disruptive is good because, quote, we can no longer afford to invest in policies that do not advance the interests and values of the United States and our allies. Whether President Trump can be the one to succeed where so many other presidents have failed is an open question. But he promised today he will be dedicated to the task.
And I will do whatever is necessary to facilitate the agreement, to mediate, to arbitrate, anything they'd like to do. But I would love to be a mediator or an arbitrator or a facilitator, and we will get this done.
Hamas has recently changed its position, saying it will now accept a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders in Israel, and that was the policy of the Obama administration as well. President Trump has not articulated where he thinks the borders of a Palestinian state should be and isn't even really sold on the idea that there should be a two-state solution. Brett?
John, on another issue, we've seen a lot of executive orders out of this president. What's the status on the president's executive order on religious liberty?
A very controversial one coming tomorrow. Fox News has learned that the president will sign an executive order which will instruct the Treasury Department and the IRS to not enforce the provisions of the so-called Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches and other tax-exempt organizations from engaging in religious activity, and at the same time will also allow certain nonprofit organizations, businesses, hospitals, and educational institutions to exclude certain medical benefits for religious reasons. You'll remember the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Abortion services and contraception was the issue there, as well as a recent case on Hobby Lobby. So a very controversial executive order coming tomorrow, Brett, but one that has been much sought after by religious organizations.
That will be a big deal for those organizations. John, thank you. Stephen Colbert has long been known for the intellectual quality he brings to his stand-up comedy, but an on-air rant against President Trump this week saw the late-night talk show host descending to a level of vulgarity seldom seen on network television. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen has the story and the fallout, or lack thereof.
When you insult one member of the CBS family, you insult us all.
The pretext for Monday night's rant by comedian Stephen Colbert was a defense of colleague John Dickerson, whose Sunday show the president had mocked as Deface the Nation. Then America's top-rated late-night host went where no man had ever gone before.
You're the presidents, but you're turning into a real pricktator. You talk like a sign language gorilla who got hit in the head. In fact, the only thing your mouth is good for is being Vladimir Putin's holster.
Colbert's shocking use of profanity, while undoubtedly funny to segments of the viewing audience, marked to many eyes a dubious new landmark in the annals of political satire.
Never have I seen a joke like this, so tasteless and so crude, uttered on network television, and it was on tape. That means that somebody at CBS thought it was okay to air this.
As Colbert's riff racked up nearly 3 million YouTube views, a Fire Colbert hashtag swiftly formed on Twitter, with calls for a boycott of products advertised on The Late Show. The Family Research Council called the joke below the belt, a new low.
Can you imagine if the roles were reversed and a conservative comedian used a homophobic slur to refer to President Obama or Hillary Clinton?
The controversy bears some structural similarity to an episode in 2012 when conservative commentator Rush Limbaugh, America's top-rated radio host, called Georgetown law student Sandra Fluck, an advocate for federal subsidization of female contraception, a slut and a prostitute.
She wants to be paid to have sex. She's having so much sex she can't afford the contraception.
Then House Speaker John Boehner, a Republican, rebuked Limbaugh, as did President Obama.
The remarks that were made don't have any place in the public discourse.
Limbaugh apologized after advertisers pulled ads from his show.
Companies tend to yank their advertising dollars only when there's a big media firestorm. The media love Stephen Colbert and are far more receptive to anti-Trump humor.
A number of parties we contacted for comment on the Colbert rant either refused or never responded. These include current House Speaker Paul Ryan, Democratic Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi, CBS, and the White House, Bret, where Press Secretary Sean Spicer told us he wouldn't dignify Colbert's comments with a response.
On this with the panel, James, thank you. Well, what do you think at home? What do you think should be done about Colbert's rant? If anything, let me know on Twitter at Bret Baier and use the hashtag special report, or on Facebook at facebook.com/BretBaierSR. Police in and around Chicago are searching right now at this hour for whoever shot and wounded a pair of undercover officers last night. Correspondent Matt Finn has an update.
An intense manhunt for the suspects considered armed and dangerous who opened fire on 2 Chicago police officers. Police say Tuesday night 2 plainclothes officers were working a case in an unmarked van when the suspects fired at the officers with a high-powered gun and took off. One officer was hit in the back, the other in the arm and hip. Both are doing okay and were released from the hospital Wednesday. Police officials say they've recovered 2 weapons. 3 people of interest are in custody, including a female who may have helped the suspects get away. Investigators think there are still multiple individuals at large that are tied to this police ambush. The shootings happened in a South Side neighborhood that's been a recent hotbed of gang activity. According to the police, gang members are increasingly using high-powered rifles, even AK-47s, posing a new threat.
It's another example of how dangerous this job is. And I think people take it for granted that when police officers come to work every day, they put their lives on the line.
This latest shooting fuels the fiery political debate on Chicago's daily deadly violence, with police and city leaders pleading for stronger laws and prosecution against repeat gun offenders.
I'm willing to stake my reputation today on the fact that the individuals who perpetrated this act against our police are probably known gang members and probably repeat gun offenders.
This is a sensitive case. Police have not released a description of the suspects, and they're also not identifying the undercover police officers because of the nature of the work they do in Chicago's dangerous neighborhoods. Bret?
Matt Finn, live in Chicago. Matt, thank you. Up next, what is it really like to live in North Korea? We'll hear from an outspoken defector. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 8 in New Orleans, as Justice Department officials say they will not pursue charges against 2 white Baton Rouge police officers involved in the death of a black man last summer. The fatal shooting of Alton Sterling prompted days of protests last July that culminated in the killings of 3 Baton Rouge police officers. Fox 16 in Little Rock, Arkansas, as the failure of a levee on the Black River prompts a flash flood warning and calls for evacuations in that area. The National Weather Service is advising people who live along that river to move to higher ground immediately. And this is a live look at Seattle from our affiliate, Q13 Fox. One of the big stories there tonight, a small plane makes an emergency landing on Harbor Point Boulevard, currently in North Korean custody. Tonight, senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palcott talks with a North Korean defector with plenty to say about what's going on there and how the world is responding.
Hunsa Lee is one of the best-known defectors from North Korea, and at only 37, one of the most outspoken about the controlling North Korean regime of Kim Jong-un.
North Korean regime really good at control people. I think they're the best dictator in this whole planet.
After fleeing North Korea in 1997 when she was still in her teens, and then following difficult years in China, she finally made it to South Korea and the West. Her book, The Girl with 7 Names, referring to the aliases she used during her escape, is a global bestseller. Her TED Talk speech has been viewed online some 13 million times. She talks about slavery under the rigid regimes of Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather.
We just only received this much and we don't have enough. So that's how we automatically become the slave of the regime.
She witnessed executions, indoctrination, and a famine in the 90s which left an estimated 1 million dead and abandoned.
Because of so many dead bodies, and there's some people, certain people's job is to get rid of those bodies. And
the job is to get rid of them.
Yeah.
She was also taught about enemy number 1, America.
We don't have the words like Americans, but American bastards. It's one word.
One word.
Always American bastards, American bastards.
Fast forward to today and President Trump's tough talk about North Korea. Hunsa said when she first heard it, she cried.
No any president say that words until today, because even though we have suffered for 7 decades.
The challenge is delivering on that rhetoric. She says North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is a dangerous foe with his nukes and missiles and repression. The killing this year of his half-brother in Malaysia, a warning.
If they want to do something, they could do, because
they could do something against you?
Yeah.
Still, she holds on to a dream. Do you think that sometime in your life you'll be able to go back to your old home?
I strongly believe it.
You believe it?
I believe it.
Aside from trying to kill them, the regime of Kim Jong-un brands defectors like Hun Lee liars. We checked her accounts with experts. We were told she's the real deal, and a brave one, too. Bret.
Great story. Greg Palcott in London. Greg, thank you. Rebel leaders bolted from today's Syria peace talks. However, the idea of establishing safe zones discussed yesterday between President Trump and the Russian leader Vladimir Putin seems to be gaining some traction. As the talking proceeds, so too does the deadly violence. Correspondent John Huddy has the latest from our Middle East newsroom.
The twisted and charred metal burned in the street of what was left of the vehicle used in a car bomb attack today in northern Syria, a country ravaged by war.
The intentional result of the bombing is 5 dead and more than 12 or 13 injured men.
The attack happened in the town of Azaz, just a few miles from the Turkish border, a region blackened by Syria's more than 6-year civil war. Today, the 4th round of peace talks this year alone started in Kazakhstan, attempting to reach a sustainable ceasefire, an exhaustive mission that has failed many times already. A U.S. delegation is involved in the talks, along with diplomats from Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Opposition leaders are demanding once again that Syria's government stops bombing rebel-held areas. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia and the Syrian regime would halt flights over specified zones if all sides respect a ceasefire. The talks also focus on creating so-called safe zones in Syria to ensure that a ceasefire holds. 4 zones where fighting would be stopped between government and rebel forces and monitored by international observers, allowing for the return of refugees. The civil war has resulted in the death of more than 300,000 people and the displacement of more than 11 million people. The safe zone plan has White House support.
We discussed this topic with Mr. Trump over the phone yesterday, and as far as I understand, the American administration supports the idea.
But problems have already started in the talks. Opposition leaders walked out of a meeting today protesting, they say, Russian airstrikes on civilians, an accusation that Russia denies. Well, the talks are scheduled to continue tomorrow, and another attempt to bring both sides to the table. Bret.
John Huddy in our Middle East newsroom. John, thank you. Puerto Rico's governor has announced an historic restructuring of some of the territory's $70 billion debt. The decision to go through the courts is a process similar to bankruptcy. It will protect Puerto Rico from several lawsuits filed yesterday when a freeze on such litigation expired. Here in the markets, stocks were mixed. The Dow gained 8, the S&P 500 lost 3, the Nasdaq dropped 23. Meantime, the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates right where they are for now. Let's get some analysis of that from Fox Business Network's Liz Klayman in New York. Good evening, Liz. How does the Fed see the jobs market right now?
Well, I'll tell you something. They addressed it very strongly. The good news is, though, that they don't see it, at least at this moment, slowing down like they do see the economy. So the borrowing of money remains cheap because the Fed announced today what was widely expected, and that was that rates will stay historically very low, about 0.75% to 1%, no change at all. Why? Well, the Fed statement indicated that they see this pace of economic growth slowing. And remember, the latest GDP number out for the quarter was just 0.7%. So the Fed, in essence, is giving a nod to the fact that the economy is still trying to pull itself out of the quicksand. Now, that's actually not President Trump's fault, or it wouldn't be any other president's fault, because the first quarter, Bret, is sort of widely seen as the weakest of the year for a whole host of reasons that economists get excited about. But let's just say it has to do with the way the government collects data. However, President Trump has said that if something close to what he has proposed as a tax plan were to be passed by Congress, Congress, growth would spike to about 3%. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has said that it might take about 2 years to reach 3%. But for now, everybody's looking toward the next Fed meeting, which is in June. And Wall Street traders, they'll bet on anything. They're going to bet that there's a 71 chance of a rate hike next month. But even with Republicans controlling the House, Bret, and of course the Senate, we've seen some real divisiveness. So among them, tax reform is not guaranteed. That leaves the Fed to scrutinize every piece of data to give it direction, including the May jobs report, which is out Friday. So the conundrum is that the Fed addressed the jobs report, saying that even as economic activity slowed, job growth remains strong, and it'll continue to show more muscle.
Yeah, quickly, Liz, you know, today we saw the health care bill being talked about, and as they looked like they were getting more votes or closer to it, it looked like the market took a little uptick there. The House also passed the spending bill today by a wide margin. That now goes to the Senate. Could that affect markets, people's money?
I would say absolutely, because lately you've seen that news out of D.C. is affecting the stock market. Now, the news that the House was voting on the spending bill, you're right. It hit right before the market closed. And while we didn't see any dramatic spikes, the Dow, which had been negative most of the day, kind of clawed its way into the green, stayed there. And then the NASDAQ and the S&P cut their losses. So now we wait for the Senate and we'll see. But tomorrow there might be some interesting moves in the markets.
Yeah, with health care pending, too. Liz, thank you. American Airlines is cutting the already sparse legroom for travelers in economy class. The airline says it will trim 2 more inches between seats in some sections so it can add more seats to its new Boeing 737 MAX jetliners. That will leave as little as 29 inches of space. United Airlines is also said to be considering such a move. Speaking of flying, scientists in Florida are trying to do something about mosquitoes before the summer hits. Correspondent Phil Keating tells us about a new approach to an old problem.
Ready?
The Florida Keys will have 40,000 mosquitoes a week flying in to take their own little buzzing vacations of sorts.
You can hear them. 1,000 male Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in this tube.
And Catherine Brzezinski's got 20 of these tubes, all full of mosquitoes.
So this looks like a good spot.
Twice a week, she walks this 10-acre test site on Stock Island, part industrial, part residential, blowing the mosquitoes out into the air to then go find a female and mate.
They might be a little annoying if they're flying around, you know, 1,000 right next to you. I'm not annoyed, but you guys might be a little annoyed. But, like, I just ate one.
These mosquitoes come from Kentucky's Mosquito Mate Laboratory, where they've been fed a natural bacteria called Wolbachia. That bacteria sterilizes the males. Males don't bite, just the females. And that leads to the mad science.
That's the key advantage of this, is they're self-delivering. They find females, and when they mate with those females, doesn't kill the females, but their eggs don't hatch.
And logically, the mosquito population should then dramatically shrink. This species of mosquito can infect humans with the potentially deadly viruses Zika, dengue fever, and chikungunya. Zika is linked to birth defects in babies born to women who became infected while pregnant. The mosquitoes thrive in South Florida's humid subtropical climate, and the wet season begins in less than a month, which is why the mosquito experts are quite eager to see how effective these buzzing tubes will be.
Year-round, we have beautiful weather, so if there was no mosquito control down here, it would be detrimental to our community.
It would be miserable.
It would be miserable.
Last year, the Keys intended a similar lab mosquito release, but with genetically modified mosquitoes. But that
approved the bill. What this amendment would do is provide additional funds directly into the high-risk pools.
As if it's enough to provide support for pre-existing conditions.
I'm anxious to vote yes. I'm anxious to see what the Senate will do with our product.
Trump care cannot pass the Senate. So to my moderate Republican colleagues in the House, I ask, why would you risk a yes vote?
We just need to take the vote and do it, and I think it passes as soon as we do.
We've been gaining votes today, and that's been a real positive development.
Meetings are continuing at this hour up on Capitol Hill. We cannot say yet whether they're going to try to vote on repeal and replacing Obamacare, this health care bill, tomorrow in the House. We can say a lot of meetings happened today. For example, the Vice President was up on Capitol Hill, as was the HHS Secretary, the CMS Administrator. And there was some optimism. As you look at the Dow, I mentioned it with Liz Clayman, about 11 noon, there was word that 2 key health care votes had come over, and there was indication that The Dow liked that news. Maybe it was the spending bill as well. But they're moving. Let's see how much. Let's bring in our panel. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Jonah Goldberg, senior editor at National Review. And Carol Lee, White House correspondent for The Wall Street Journal. Carol, your sense, I mean, after that meeting at the White House, is there a sense at the White House that this is kind of going to come to fruition?
They feel much better about it. I was at the White House today when the House members came out and talked to the reporters after their meeting with Trump. It was a lengthy meeting, and they seem to have reached some sort of compromise that they feel they can thread the needle with this. And the White House later, however, made some pretty significant promises, saying that the preconditions would be the same exact, the guarantee that everybody who had used the preconditions provision would have the same effect, and it wouldn't change. They also admitted that they don't know exactly what the effect would be on premiums, and so they're optimistic about this. And as you know, they've had a very tough go so far on any of the president's legislative priorities. So they would very much like a vote on this, and then it goes to the Senate, where obviously that's a much tougher haul.
You're talking about the pre-existing conditions, and this was a big problem for moderates particularly. The president also referenced it this weekend. Fred Upton from Michigan offered an amendment, and basically here he is explaining what it does.
It's our understanding that the $8 billion over the 5 years will more than cover those that might be impacted, and as a consequence keeps our pledge for those that in fact would be otherwise denied because of pre-existing illnesses. So the guess is that, should a state decide to go for a waiver, that there'd be fewer at the beginning than the end of the 5 years.
So to keep it simple, Jonah, this bill puts people into high-risk pools, and that's their solution for pre-existing conditions. If for some reason they slip through the cracks, this amendment provides money to make sure that they are covered.
Yeah, and frankly, I find the whole thing kind of bizarre. First of all, Fred Upton has been talking for years now about doing precisely what he spent the last week opposing. And it's a very bizarre, hypocritical position that he's taken. But moreover, the GOP, particularly the GOP moderates, seem to have bought into the spin that was put out in very aggressive style by the Obama administration, that the key issue here is pre-existing conditions, that is what kept people from getting insurance, when that was actually a tiny fraction of the issue. The real issue isn't pre-existing medical conditions, it's pre-existing economic conditions. But pre-existing medical conditions polls better. It's one of the only really popular features of Obamacare. And the Republicans seem to have bought into it, even though, like Tom MacArthur from New Jersey, a lot of these states, like New Jersey, already have guarantees about pre-existing conditions and had them for decades. So even if they got a waiver from Obamacare, it wouldn't affect anybody with pre-existing conditions. It's a weird poll testing a complaint of convenience rather than dealing with the actual issues about getting more people insured.
And here is Raul Labrador on this very issue, making that argument.
You guys in the media have been reporting that we're not taking care of people with pre-existing conditions, and that's just absolutely false. What our bill does, it creates what's called an invisible risk pool, where everybody's premiums are going to be going down, and some people's premiums are going to be subsidized by the government, and those people are going to be usually people with pre-existing conditions and others.
All right, Molly.
Well, the question of polling is also interesting because people actually don't support having these big provisions for pre-existing conditions when they understand how expensive it is and how little it actually has to do with health outcomes. There's also something just utterly bizarre about not understanding economics 101 of insurance, where you need to be paying into it for a long time, not having free riders who only come in and pay up once they need medical care, and then also that there's not an understanding that people who cost more in terms of what their insurance costs are should be sharing a bigger share of the burden. That doesn't mean that they have to pay all of their burden or that it should bankrupt them or anything like this, but this is just a basic schematic of insurance, is that you want to make sure that people are incentivized properly. So this is an interesting change.
Yeah, Democrats are howling. Senator Schumer on the floor talking about this amendment.
We don't even know if the new version would survive the rules under reconciliation. The amendment to allow states to drop pre-existing condition requirement, for instance, very possibly violates the Byrd Rule. If the moderate group in the House gets an additional amendment to deal with the very same issue, that may violate the Byrd Rule as well.
And before everybody at home glazes over, the Byrd rule, just to be clear, this is from the Washington Post. In the 80s, Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat of West Virginia, advocated for a rule to prevent anything that doesn't directly change the level of spending or revenue, or where the changes are mere incidental to the policy, from being passed under reconciliation. It's known as the Byrd rule, and any senator can raise a point of order under it to challenge a policy's pertinence to the budget. The Byrd rule is largely what keeps policymakers from just passing an entire Obamacare repeal replace bill under reconciliation and calling it a day. Reconciliation, Carol, enables the Republicans to vote it through with 51 votes and not 60.
Right, and that's what you just described there is one of the many challenges that this legislation is going to have when it moves to the Senate. Republicans can only afford to lose 2 senators in whatever process takes place in the Senate, however they change that bill. So that's going to be a challenge. And then obviously it has to go back to the House, and they have to reconcile that there. So we're in the beginning of a very long process, and I think what's happened is that the White House has so much wanted just some sort of movement on their legislative agenda that they've put a lot of stock in this one House vote, but it's really just the beginning.
Any other day, Jonah, the leader of the Palestinian Authority meeting with the president in the Oval Office would have been the top. But this is drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, and it's been like this, it feels like now for, what, 103 days. It's a newsy environment. It's remarkable.
Is the Middle East peace talk that the president said, you know, he said, well, they might not have been as tough as it has been. I believe that we can get this done. And he says, let's prove him wrong. And Abbas says, okay.
It's delightful to see this level of optimism about fixing something that goes back for so long. But it's good that people are beginning.
That would reflect on her intent from the beginning and not speak about it would require an act of concealment, in my view. Concealing, in my view, would be catastrophic. This was terrible. It makes me mildly nauseous to think that we might have had some impact on the election. But honestly, it wouldn't change the decision.
I do think there was a third door available to you in late last year, just before the election, and that was to confirm the existence of an ongoing investigation about the Trump campaign.
My judgment was consistent with the principles I've always operated under. That was the right thing to do.
FBI Director James Comey saying also in that testimony that the, quote, capper for him was when Attorney General Loretta Lynch met with former President Bill Clinton on that tarmac. Then he was asked about some specific information by Senator Chuck Grassley.
The email reportedly provided assurances that Attorney General Lynch would protect Secretary Clinton by making sure the FBI investigation, quote, unquote, didn't go too far. How and when did you first learn of this document? Also, who sent it and who received it?
That's not a question I can answer in this forum, Mr. Chairman, because it would call for a classified response.
Did the FBI interview the person who wrote the email? If not, why not?
I have to give you the same answer. I can't talk about that in an unclassified setting.
So that obviously raised some eyebrows. We're back with the panel. Molly.
Jim Comey is very good at these self-righteous defenses of why he did what he did with regard to the Clintons and also with the Trump campaign. But it was really interesting how many questions he didn't answer. And with he had lots of answers for what happened with the Clinton email situation. But he didn't have a lot of answers about the Russian investigation. And I thought Lindsey Graham had a very deft line of questioning where he asked him, do you still stand by the statement that the Trump campaign wasn't spied on? And he said, absolutely. And he said, did you get a warrant on a FISA warrant on Carter Page? He's like, I'm not going to answer that question. And he didn't answer it in part, partly because you're not supposed to talk about FISA warrants, but partly because that would completely contradict what had been said. Senator Grassley also mentioned that there were material inconsistencies between what Comey had told him and Dianne Feinstein in private meetings and the information they were getting from the Justice Department. So this was the more interesting part of the hearing from my perspective.
Jonah.
Well, first of all, let me say that I am nauseated by Director Comey's misuse of the word nauseous. But more broadly, I'll tell you, the thing that still, I know
Thank you for the grammarian
element. The thing that still I find flabbergasting, and it kind of brought back, it sort of triggered a memory from the campaign that we kind of put away, is why isn't Huma Abedin in jail or in a lot of trouble, and Anthony Weiner? I have friends who have, and family who have intelligence, have security clearance that would be carted out of the building in handcuffs for doing a fraction of sending, in Comey's words, thousands of emails to Anthony Weiner, who, let's just say, there are things in his life that make him susceptible to manipulation and blackmail. Forwarding them to be printed out.
Let's listen to that, where he's asked about that moment.
Was there classified information on former Congressman Weiner's computer?
Yes.
Who sent it to him?
His then spouse, Huma Abedin, appears to have had a regular practice of forwarding emails to him, for him, I think, to print out for her, so she could then deliver them to the Secretary of State.
And to Jonah's point, that's strange.
Yeah, and what this hearing did is underscore a couple of things. One is we're still relitigating the election. Both the president is constantly doing that, and Hillary Clinton was out this week, and now we have James Comey. And so that has not exited the stage. And also, you know, there's a growing consent of frustration with Comey on a number of levels, both what he did past during the campaign, from Democrats saying he should have disclosed the Russia investigation, Republicans saying he didn't go far enough with Hillary Clinton for exactly that clip you just showed, and yet he's now in this position where the White House still has confidence in him, and he's in the middle to a certain extent. And you know, I think there's also a general consensus that among members on the Hill that they're not getting enough information from him, that he's not disclosing, and it's not consistent. And so generally everyone would like for this Russia investigation to wrap up rather quickly, because it's taking up all this time on Capitol Hill. It's a cloud over the White House.
Let me play one soundbite on the Russia side. This is Senator Leahy.
President Trump again said the hacking of the DNC and other efforts to influence the election could have been China, could have been a lot of different groups. Is that contrary to what the intelligence community has said?
We have high confidence that the Russians did the hacking of the DNC and the other organizations.
And he went on to say that he thinks Russia is still involved in American politics.
Well, another thing that was very interesting that was revealed during this hearing was that Fusion GPS, there's a complaint at the Justice Department saying they should have registered as a Russian agent because they were taking money from Russia at the same time they were preparing the dossier against Trump, a dossier